Hello, welcome to this video lesson designed to help you understand the poem London by William Blake. We're going to work through the basic background of the poem, then the reading, and then finally onto the analysis of Blake's craft when he was designing it. Please make sure you've got your anthology with you so you can add notes, but be sure to leave some space just in case. So, onto the basic background of the poem London. It was written in 1794, and therefore it's kind of during the Industrial Revolution. This was a time of rapid manufacturing changes, which led to more pollution and poor workplace conditions, but also the increase in wealth for the people who owned the factories and the companies. It's written by a famous poet called William Blake, who wrote this poem as a way of criticizing society at the time. Like Percy Shelley, he was a romantic poet, so he favoured the simple things in life, the beauty of life, nature, and things like that. One criticism that he had was the failure of the church, who were very powerful at the time, to help children in London who were forced to work. This is a time before compulsory education. So if a child was from a poor family, chances are instead of being educated, they would have to work. Other criticisms were dangerous industrial conditions for normal workers, prostitution, poverty, and the gap between the rich and the poor. Throughout the poem, Blake is walking through London and he sees and hears all of the suffering that he goes into detail about. Interestingly, in 1789, which is 5 years before this poem was published, the French people in the French Revolution revolted against their monarchy and aristocracy, so the people with the most power, using violence and murder to overthrow them. There are hints that London could meet a similar fate in this poem. So there are lots of words that are a little bit tricky in this poem, so I have translated them along the sides. What I recommend you do is before I read it, just have a quick look at what these translations actually mean. So, for example, what chartered, woe, and mark actually mean. So, London. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mine-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So we're going to move on to the phase where we make sure we understand the poem. If you've done the Ozymandias lesson, you'll know that part of that is making sure you understand the basic context, the who, what, where, when, and why, and how. If you understand those, you understand the poem. We'll start with who. So who is mentioned in this poem? First of all, it starts with I, just like Ozymandias, and that means that the speaker is probably, most likely, William Blake himself. He looks at all of these faces, and this poem references the people of London in general. Men and infants are crying out. Chimney sweepers, well, who would they have been? They probably would have been very small to fit up the chimney, so they probably would have been children. We've got soldiers as well, and youthful harlots. So that would be young women forced into prostitution. So when and where? I wonder. So Blake is walking through London. It seems to last the majority of the day because in the final stanza, he says, but most through midnight streets I hear. This is a reference at the end, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. It's a reference to the future, as though those who were married are doomed. Could be another criticism of the church as well there. In terms of where, we know that he's wandering through London. Specifically, it starts along the busy streets near the Thames. Everything seems to be owned by someone, even the river. He visits many places, one of them being the church. And so on to what? What is this poem actually about? What actually happens in it? So if we break the stanzas down, in the first one, Blake is walking through London and he notices how everything seems to be owned, yet no one seems happy or free. Everyone seems to be suffering. He then notices how, no matter what the age, everyone seems to be crying out in pain in some way. He imagines chains that hold everyone in their place. He then criticizes more. So there's more criticism of the country here. The churches do not help children, and royalty are to blame for the amount of lives lost at war. And then finally, London is also corrupt and diseased, which causes suffering. He refers to STIs transmitted through prostitutes and comments on how, even if they escape it all, they are doomed to live unhappily. All of that will become clearer later when we analyse the poem. So how has the poem been put together? Again, if you work through Ozymandias, you'll understand that form is the kind of poem it is, how it's been constructed. So this is a first-person poem. We know that because the speaker is talking directly to us. The speaker is probably William Blake. It's a dramatic monologue, not like another poem, My Last Duchess, but it is a little bit different. But it is a dramatic monologue. The speaker is talking directly to us about his experiences. There are 4 stanzas with 4 lines each, lots of rhythm, perhaps to reflect his walk. There's an A-B rhyme scheme throughout. If you don't know what that is, it's just illustrated there. Look how cry rhymes with sigh and appalls rhymes with walls. Does this reflect the rigid structures in London? So sometimes the way that poems are constructed, they can reflect the deep meanings that they have. In this case, does the rigid structure of the A-B, 4 lines per stanza, does that represent the structures put in place in London, how inescapable they are for the people who are suffering? So, the human condition, the why is the poem been made? What was the purpose? What was the message? What were Blake's ideas? So we need to think about what we're learning about life and human nature. That's what the human condition means. So, do we learn that those with power do not care about those without? I think that's what the poem seems to be saying. There is a great contrast between the rich and the poor, which will become clearer later. The poorest people are trapped in a cycle, which we see all the way through the poem. The richest are away and protected from this misery. They don't see it. We'll talk more about that later again. It is a criticism of society. Powerful establishments like the church do nothing to help the vulnerable. And it is a warning that this unrest could lead to revolution. So now we're going to start looking at the themes in the poem to actually explore it in a bit more detail. A theme is a recurring idea throughout a text which supports the thoughts, purposes, and messages of the writer. So if we were to pick out 3 big themes in this poem, suffering and misery would be one, the powerless would be one, and the powerful would be one. There are other possibilities as well, but we'll just focus on these 3. So let's start with suffering and misery. So if I was to explore this theme, the first step I would take is to pick out any evidence that I could of anything that is being said about suffering and or misery in these stanzas. So this is what I've arrived at. For all of these quotes that I've highlighted, I think there's something to be said about suffering and misery. I found things that Blake has done deliberately to convey messages about suffering and misery. So let's start with, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. So the superlative every, the superlative you can't have more than every, emphasizes how he saw no one who escaped the misery of London. There were no exceptions whatsoever to this suffering that he saw. The repetition of marks is interesting as well. So when he says, and mark in every face I meet, he means I notice in every face I meet. And then the marks of weakness and marks of woe, they're physical marks, as in signs. He sees signs of weakness and signs of woe. And this makes us imagine both physical and mental suffering. Next, the alliteration of weakness and woe highlights the sadness of these people. So woe means extreme misery, extreme sadness. But also weakness is interesting because it emphasizes the idea of them physically being weak. Are they undernourished, so they're not eating enough? Or are they overworked? Are they overtired? Are they ill? That does seem to be hinted at later on. So, next stanza. Cry of fear and every ban. I think that these two quotes definitely emphasize suffering and misery. Blake uses sensory imagery throughout his walk. That just means he creates images that are related to our five senses. In this case, he can hear, as well as seeing the suffering, he can hear the cries of the children and the shouting and cursing of what seems like everyone. And the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood. We're going to talk about this quote quite a lot, more so later. But even those outside of London, like the soldiers, who must return, are miserable. The adjective hapless conveys how helpless and doomed the soldiers are when they are sent away by those with power. Remember from earlier the translation, hapless means unfortunate as well. So you feel that Blake feels a sense of sympathy for them. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. So what we've got here is a contrast between youth and illegal adult business. So youthful harlot, it's too young to be working in this kind of an industry, but also it's illegal, it's adult. There's a strange contrast between what she is and what she's doing. Young women were forced to work as prostitutes before the age of consent and compulsory education. They were doomed from birth if they were born into families poor enough. What that basically means is that if a young woman was born into a family who was really struggling or maybe even orphaned, this may be one of the only courses that she could have taken. So Blake comments on how they scream out so loudly that they drown out the crying of babies, who also, in his poem, are doomed. So that was suffering and misery. Now on to the powerless. So we're going to look at the people who have no power in this poem. So same again, picking out just the quotes that are in any way related to the idea of powerlessness. Let's start with the anaphora of in every, in every, in every. Anaphora is basically just repeating lines, line openings, sorry, just like that. In every, in every, in every. It highlights how he found no exceptions to the suffering. None of the powerful or wealthy people can be seen, and they make no noise or suffering. So essentially, all he can see are the working classes, the people who are working hard all day, every day, the people who are suffering for whatever reason. There are no exceptions, and that means that there are none of the wealthy, comfortable people in his view. Every man, infants, voice, chimney sweepers, hapless soldiers could go for youthful harlot as well in that. Blake tells us who he hears and sees on his journey. Men, women, boys and girls all suffer. No matter what age or sex, London victimizes everyone. Even soldiers who fight for the country are doomed. Now, this is a great quote. The mind forged manacles. If you don't know what forged means, it basically just means kind of crafted, created. This is a metaphor for the control of the powerful and the way the powerless feel trapped, almost imprisoned by their miserable way of life. So let's break that down. Mind forged indicates that these manacles, which means chains, are made in their imaginations. They're not actually physically chained up, but they do not know any different. Their lives are so set in that way of suffering that they feel trapped without any sense of escape. How can they improve their way of life if they have no idea how it could be improved? Right, finally, onto the last line. And blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So there's a lot here to process. So blights means uncontrollably affect, infect, sorry, and then plagues implies a quick spread of disease. So there's different ways that you can read this. Number one, this could refer to the illnesses and suffering of those in London. Everyone will feel it. So you could make it quite general. But interestingly, it ends with marriage hearse, which is an oxymoron. Basically, an oxymoron is when you've got a pairing of words that contrast against each other. So marriage hearse is pairing something associated with happiness and feeling complete, marriage, with the vehicle used to transport a body to a funeral, hearse. So is Blake saying that everyone is doomed, even when they think that they are happy? Even people who are about to get married, who are at the peak of their happiness, they are doomed. Did the men also, this is a second interpretation, did the men who were visiting the youthful harlots catch these diseases and therefore their marriages are cursed because of that? That's the reference to STIs that we went through earlier. Essentially, then, when it comes to the powerless, there's this great sense of doom that there's no one who escapes it. If these people are working class or indeed they don't have money at all, then they are stuck, they are trapped. So let's look at the contrast then, the powerful, those who do have power. We have to look hard to actually find them in this poem. And even when Blake is walking around London, he doesn't really see much evidence of them at all. So it's interesting that Blake calls on his walk, he calls the streets charted and he calls the Thames charted as well. So even the river, part of nature, seems to be owned by those wealthy enough to control docks. So we'd be talking people, dock controllers, yes, but we'd be talking people who have their businesses on the Thames, people who travel in and out, things like that. So Chartered Street is also interesting. Everything seems bound in law. It all seems like it's been owned. And even the streets themselves, the physical streets, seem like they're owned. There's official documents to prove it. So basically, everything seems like it's owned. And if everything's owned, that means that no one is free. So it's a comment, on, again, at the beginning, just at the first two lines, it's a comment on the freedom that these people lack, this idea of imprisonment for the people of London. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. So poor children would have had to have worked to survive and support their families. They are among the people who cry out. And we know that part of this poem's criticism is how children are not being supported in any way. The tragedy that children had to work in this time. But then we've got the blackening, and it's interesting that that Blake uses blackening before church. So it conveys the process of the church becoming darker, which is a reference to them not helping the vulnerable, like children. When becoming darker and blacker, it is losing its purity and morality. So it's kind of a metaphor there. And the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So we've talked about hapless before. The adjective does evoke how helpless and unfortunate soldiers are. They're forced to risk their lives for the sake of the powerful people in society. Interestingly, though, he says that it runs in blood down palace walls. So this is a bit of a metaphor. The wealthy connotations of palace contrast with the suffering around it. Blood symbolizes the death that they cause, but this is the most interesting bit for me. Walls. The blood is running down the palace walls. And that indicates that the suffering and blame never actually reaches the powerful people. It's running down the outsides of their structures, running down the outsides of their buildings, but it isn't actually ever getting in. It's not affecting them. Nothing's ever changing because the people who have all the power are ignorant to it. They're ignoring it. They don't care about it. It never reaches them. They never see it. So I think that's the significance of walls. that these walls along the palaces, the people who are actually sending these people out to suffer, they don't know the suffering that they are causing, and it feels like they don't care. So that was London. If you need any more help with the poem, there's plenty more to say. That was just a quick overview. There's plenty more to explore. You could find more on the guides on the English Revision Drive. You could also use the useful websites, genius.com, SparkNotes, Schmoop, Bitesize, and YouTube. Lots of really good resources there for you to find additional ideas about London. Thanks for listening.